means, okay, if we want to take him out, we're going to go the other direction and say, end this war. Stop it. Enough blood's been spilled. McClellan, personally, from his writings, from his letters, which are pretty well collected, we can tell pretty well that he was not much of a peacenik. He just hated Abraham Lincoln. In the election of 1864, Lincoln, I knew I should look some of this stuff. I think I'm right about this. Lincoln took 55%, McClellan 45%. That's not really all that close. And if you consider that half the country couldn't vote, the southern states made up half of the United States. They didn't have balance. So this was all Northerners, and Lincoln only pulled 55%. So it's more than a little chance that McClellan, not alone, but McClellan and his very powerful political machine could have pulled this off. War sentiment in general ran the gamut, just like in the 1960s. Very, very comparable. There were riots in New York City. There were draft riots, for heaven's sake. We had bread riots in Richmond. You had an awful lot of people. It's difficult to compartmentalize, because if a historian 100 years from now says what was war sentiment like in 1966, how would you answer that? It's a non-answer, I know, but not unified by any stretch of the imagination. Not unified at all.
So you don't necessarily think that if McClellan had won, there would have been peace?
Oh, I think if McClellan had won, he would have sued for peace, absolutely. Because the political machine behind him was certainly willing to stop. What probably would have happened, and here we're in speculative history, and I apologize because it really is caca, it doesn't mean anything. But my opinion is that absolutely it would have returned with some compromises on both sides. Slavery in some way, shape, or form would have survived. It would have been changed somewhat. There would have been changes. Again, the great Shelby Foote, I keep bringing him back, but he said that the great American art was always compromise. And we lost our way for a while. But ironically, I think had McClellan won, there would have been a peace achieved sooner. But at what price? And would it have lasted? We made a peace of sorts by agreeing to leave the whole slavery thing out of the Constitution, didn't we? And we see where that took us, the Missouri Compromise and all the way through all of that mess. Is it really better that we didn't address it when we did? So, it can go either way. My answers are terrible. Are you allowed to ask questions? All right.
This is the one you planted. That's not true. Hey, what about Chancellorsville? I mean, a lot of people, maybe that's a tactical high water mark, but clearly that inspires Lee to go into Gettysburg, right? So I was thinking that you would say Gettysburg wasn't and Chancellorsville may.
Oh, Chancellorsville. Yeah, Chancellorsville. Tactically, again, I'm not a Stonewall Jackson fan. I am not in any way, shape, or form. And everybody is, Jackson, in that battle. And I think Stuart would have done just as well. I think he proved that he could do perfectly well after Jackson was shot. Chancellorsville was a bump on the road for me with Lee. Lee, and I mentioned this a couple times in the lecture, so I'll mention this again. Lee has been accused by his very few detractors, but has been accused of being overly aggressive strategically, to the degree that things like Antietam, what's the point? What are you really going to achieve long-term from this? That Lee maybe did not think all that far with those things. Just aggression, aggression, aggression. You hit the enemy and you keep hitting and you keep hitting. The invasion of Pennsylvania was something that had been in the works up here for a little while. He wanted to do it. He was looking for a way to do it. Ever since Antietam, he wanted to do it again. And it was already in the works. I mean, they spoke about it. I think he and Longstreet and Jackson spoke about it there at Chancellorsville. Somebody wrote that. The victory allowed it to happen pretty much immediately, with Hooker going down. Hooker gets a lot of crap, too. I kind of like Hooker, to be honest with you. I like the guy. I think he gets bad press.
You like the general.
Well, yes, yeah.
That joke.
I think he gets bad press. Ooh, he was a little wacky at Chancellorsville. Well, he had a ball blow up a column 3 feet from him. You try commanding an army like that. He got a bad rep. I like him. I think it would have happened anyhow. I think that the victory being as total as it was just made Lee that much more convinced. Yes, absolutely, the time to do it is now. But for Lee, the time to do that stuff was always now. Had there been... I just think had it been another battle a month later, that's what he would have used to justify the invasion. Lee wanted to invade the North. He had some good reasons for it: repositioning, making the North think twice. Ooh, they're coming to get us. All these things that we say. But those are still all short-term That's me. No way. I was about to call out somebody. That's rude! None of those invasions to me are going to be high watermarks because none of them, I think, fulfill any long-term strategic goals. I guess that's the end of it for me.
Why did they kick out the French and British so early in the war? Why did the Confederates do that?
1863, it was largely it was kind of jealousy, really, because after Emancipation Proclamation, not the January '03 enactment, but the September '62 announcement of it, that pretty much, once that reached, that took about a month to reach Palmerston's desk. And pretty much, to my knowledge of it anyway, I've researched it pretty well, that really was an almost absolute kibosh on the whole support of the Confederacy thing. Once that came through, the Lords maybe, but the House of Commons, absolutely no way. And Lincoln knew that. That's exactly why he did that. Well, one of the reasons why he did that, because he knew the effect that would have specifically on British House of Commons. So by '63, the British were kind of washing their hands of what little diplomatic involvement they had with the Confederacy as it is, which was already poor. Jefferson Davis was terrible, terrible at foreign policy. He didn't have one. He just expected it to happen around him. It's another lecture, but it was they largely booted them. Well, you're not gonna help make us a country. Well, you can leave. It really was very similar to that, I'm afraid. It was pretty ugly. It was 63, April of '63, when they officially removed the English and French. But the campaign season was starting again, and they just made official, by kicking them out, something that was already de facto, that that the English and French were persona non grata in Richmond. Yes, ma'am.
An essay I read started from two pictures, Grant and Lee. There's Grant in a rumpled uniform, and he's definitely sort of the self-made man, bootstrapped, part of the going west with the railroad kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And then here was Lee in this crisp, beautiful, fresh uniform.
The courtly cavalier, yeah.
And that they were contrasting him with the sort of patrician background, the landowner, tidewater, FFV kind of background that had a certain idea this is the way things should be and this is who should rule. Do you think that had something to do with where he ended up?
Which one? Grant?
That Lee, you were talking about Lee, that kind of...
Oh, that's a whole lecture. I actually gave a similar lecture to that. How to capsulize that. In broad terms, very broad strokes, yes. Lee was a product of who he was. Ironic, because Lee was fairly broke most of his life. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Lee ever owned a piece of property outright in his life, did he? Yeah. No. Yeah. He man never owned anything.
Did his wife,
Pardon?
did his wife own
Yeah, whatever he had was his wife, and of course the Yankees took that. So, man, he was military.
They thought he owned it though, when they took it. They didn't take it because he owned it. They thought he owned it.
Oh yeah, and that was his residence, which is why they trashed it. But no, he wasn't allowed to have his name on a whole lot of stuff. People remembered who his daddy was, so he always had a bit of a hard time with that, coming from a bit of a questionable background. So with Lee, yes, he's certainly a product of his environment, and I've done a long lecture series on who we were and why we fought with regard to the war, that we're different people. Southerners and Northerners in the 1860s were a different people, and they had come up differently. The cultures of Massachusetts and Virginia, which spawned the Tidewater and the New England settlements, themselves came from different places, produced different people. I've long argued, and could do so if we had a few more hours here, that the American Civil War was in a lot of ways a culmination of the English Civil War. I could go on in a lot of detail on that. But yes, Lee was a product of that Cavalier society, that dying Cavalier society. And Grant was a new man. I mentioned that. I think of him as a modern man. There'd be no place for a Jeb Stuart, for example, the way we like to think of him in World War I. It's difficult to imagine that. For one thing, he'd be in a tank with me. But Grant, you can, quite easily. Because Grant didn't have many romantic notions about warfare. He came up similarly. He was West Pointers, like the rest, but he was just made a difference. Yeah, they're very different men. Yes, sir.
It turns out at Gettysburg, there was an English observer who was with Lee. What was his status? I mean, if in fact England had cut that off, in fact, in the middle of it, the conversation is, he was pointing out all the victories, the response of the colonel who was there is, the North can afford its defeats better than you can afford your victory.
I like the guy in the movie better than the guy in the books. The real Fremantle was a bit dull.
Okay.
But the fellow who played him at Gettysburg, I just love him. Everybody likes him in Gettysburg. Everybody's seen Gettysburg, right? You don't go to a class like this without having seen Gettysburg. Yeah, I love him. Yeah, he was a military, he was a military liaison. The folks that had been formally booted out of Richmond were diplomatic delegations. You still had, actually, several foreign observers. You had Prussian ones, and you had quite a few. But they were sort of a different animal. That's the short answer, is that they were a different animal. And he didn't stay long. I think it was shortly after that campaign that he went back home. Fremantle went back home. Yes, sir, I think I saw you first.
I understand from my reading that Lee was posted, I think, in Texas, and he got the offer of Virginia, and he got one to the United States. And he, what I've read, he acted less than honorably when he got the offer, they did that Virginia. Can you
Not much, I'll repeat that. The question is Lee, the reactions of Lee, because he received almost simultaneously, I think, the offers from Winfield Scott, I think, to command the Federal Army, and of course the offer to come to the Confederate Army. He would have gotten a better deal off the bat if he had gone right with the Federal, by the way. He ended up being Davis's lapdog in an office for the longest time before a bullet found Joe Johnston, and he found his calling. But I'm not sure I can address it well. I remember some stories, but furthermore, I seem to remember an awful lot of apocryphal stories about that. And I don't know that I can intelligently remember the difference between what probably happened and the numerous stories surrounding it. I don't know that I can. I know that thing I quoted a couple times, that he could not draw his sword against Virginia, is a quote from his written response to Scott. But, by the way, that phrase, verbatim, appears in at least one, if not two, letters written around the same time by Lee. So it is not nearly as romantic and off-the-cuff phrase as you can think. Clearly, he had already planned this out. This was the phrase he was going to use, and he used it several times because he knew that it would work. He wasn't stupid. He was courtly, but he was smart. But beyond that, I actually don't know that I remember an awful lot about the specifics of his turning down and then accepting the command with the Confederate Army. Because remember, he didn't command the entire Confederate Army, not until, I think, February of 1865, by which time Jesus himself could be put in command of the Confederate Army, and it wouldn't happen. Yes, sir.
Well, today,